Yeah. Yeah, I think that ties back into some other things we were mentioning, but like how, like at what point do you as the artist like feed into it because you know that it could either reap benefits? I think when it was it kind of sucked where like COVID came in and then it was like another season. I almost call it a season of just like well, we had kind of had a double up. You had the effects of COVID and its effects on the Asian American community or just the Asian community at all. And then you had right on the heels of that was, you know, more killings of African American men and women in, you know, unfortunate situations. And it all came like at the same time. You know, it's been almost 2 years now, I guess. And I was right at that point of like, I don't want to be used for my appearance or the tone of my skin to make some, you know, plea for whatever else. It was just like, just do the work, you know. You know.
Yeah.
So it almost, you know, I had to find myself. I know it was a art call at the Neon, and I was on the board, or I was on the panel for, you know, kind of choosing artwork, and so they you know, we kind of explicitly said we want to make sure that like these spots are done by, you know, BIPOC community. Like this is what we want. We want to show our, you know, solidarity. And, you know, for the two of us that were on the board, I say three of us of a minority, I was just like, sure. Like one person almost explicitly said they just wanted Black Lives Matter like written on the wall. I was like, that's not art. Like that's just a picket sign. That's a very cheap way of
exactly.
And I was just like, I'm not gonna apply for this one. I'll sit on this panel and help pick and choose, but I'm not gonna apply. But then I went home, and then when I came back, I had an experience that made me realize how I could affect change as an artist in that space, to where I, you know, produced a design for it. And it was to be an educational thing. So I went for a run back home, and I was just like, anything could happen to me on this run. And it made me think about the Ahmaud Arbery situation. And then I was like, I was a lot more active in running, and I was just like, people don't see us running or even existing that often in the Neon district, just as like, you know, as a part of the citizens there. And so I had artwork in the mural in that area before, but it was temporary. So I was like, oh, this would be an opportunity to get a permanent design up, to make a statement that I thought would be really powerful about just us living in communities, and not about, here's this, you know, fist in the sky.
Right.
I need you to hear me. It's like, you see me here, and this is all I'm trying to let you know, that I run these same, you know, I exercise and I do very normal things in these neighborhoods. And so that was my kind of outlook on how to, you know, kind of affect change in that regard. But outside of that, I was like, I don't want to sit on anybody's panel and help them discuss or help, you know, give them, I just wasn't in the mindset for it.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's so draining. And I always tell my friends who are in the Black community, I'm like, I'm so tired. I can't even imagine how tired you are. You know, like, I just can't even imagine. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of, like, basically what it boils down to, what you and I are talking about, is like, no matter how you split it, we're just trying to have the right to exist in the space we already exist in.
Yeah.
You know, like, we're already here. We already take up space, but it feels like we're not even allowed to take up that space.
Right.
You know, and do with it whatever we want. I mean, like, as a Filipino, it's really funny because I am totally on the outskirts of the community. When I was growing up, my parents were very active. They helped establish a lot of the organizations that are in here. In Hampton Roads, there's a large population of Filipinos because of the Navy and the military. And my parents were really active in that. And, you know, they're retired and they're mainly living back in the Philippines now. So they're not really as active anymore. But even when we were growing up, like, they didn't force me and my sister to participate, which I'm really glad for, because it was really not my thing. But even now, you know, like, I have kids, and my kids are half white, half Filipino, and I'm not really in touch with my culture, and they're totally not in touch with the culture. And it's like, on the one side, like, yay, maybe they'll just get to be people. But on the other side, I'm like, who am I kidding? You know, sometimes when you're half Filipino and half white, you look white, and sometimes you
Yeah.
look more Asian, and that's going to affect how people treat you, you know, and it's just going to happen no matter what. And I just feel like, so like now I'm trying to find ways to participate in the community and be more active. But what I'm really big on right now is creating a safe place for people in the community who have been turned away, like me, because we didn't fit the mold.
Right.
You know, because it's really frustrating. There are so many Asians, not even just Filipinos, but so many Asians who want to be in the arts. But it's like, there are these rules about like what kind of arts your people are going to think are acceptable. And unfortunately, visual arts is totally not on that list.
Yeah.
And it's like such a shame, because I mean, there's so much power in art. And I feel like, you know, one of the reasons I like being around people like you is because art makes you an intellectual. I mean, it really does. It makes you an intellectual, it makes you a philosopher, it makes you an observer of the world. And I don't know. I mean, it's like, it's just one of those really important things that, you know, we need to hear those stories, and people need to see people like us in these leadership roles, which like brings me back to, okay, do I paint or do I focus on the leadership roles?
Yeah. I find myself kind of in that same boat of kind of exploring my identity, and at what point, you know, would my art reflect my core foundation versus kind of the face value, because a majority of my work kind of explores what my experience has been, or my work so far explores what my experience has been just as like an observer of society, and not necessarily my own identity. But then in later years, I've found myself wanting to create, or even just more recently wanting to create work that reflects more so my foundational identity, and being raised in Islam, and thinking about the children that have, you know, been raised behind me in that same, you know, following the same foundations and doctrines, and what their experience might, you know, more so I want to document what their experience might look like, because I've lived through it, and saying, you know, this is what it was like as a child. And as much as we, you know, go to our meetings and have our own culture, we still have to exist in this American society where if we're not dressed up in a certain way or wearing our fez or our turban, then we just look like every other, we fit, you know, the larger group of African Americans or Blacks, and how that could affect you in, you know, kind of living a life and trying to figure out where you fit in. Because it's like, all right, today I'm with my people, and this is where I look, you know, this is what I'm doing. But then tomorrow when I go to school, I have to think about how I'm going to fit in with my same people, but we just have a different kind of raising. And so I've been wanting to kind of document that, and because of the own challenges that I've had, and being raised as the youngest of 5 children, I've never had to really speak up for myself. It's always been 4 other siblings that at the mold, and every school that I went into, everybody already knew who I was coming in almost. So it was like, I don't have to say anything. And it wasn't pretty much until like high school, college, where it was like, all right, now it's up to you. Figure it out, you know. And I had to kind of make some of those decisions on my own. And me finding that is like my way to kind of speak to and open doors through my art, but also, you know, kind of, you know, being on those boards and serving. Not, granted, you know, having moved, I don't have to serve on this meetings. When I was back home, I was definitely the full-time artist that I was back home was like completely different, because it was like, you know, every other week there was some board meeting, and then there was work, and then there was side jobs, and there was teaching. And I was
that's
just all
where I
over
am
the
now.
place.
Oh my gosh.
So much.
So
much.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I'm the youngest too, but I only have an older sister, and she's never been the one to like really speak up, and I was like the one that never shut up. and I mean, even now, like among my parents' generation, like a lot of them are friends on Facebook, and I've seen them post some really hateful stuff sometimes. Like they don't even realize, it's because it's like part of that whole systemic thing where it's like they're making judgments on Black culture because like that's what they were taught. And I like try to point that kind of stuff out. And then all of a sudden, like I'm the bad person. And like even my mom's like, leave our friends alone. And I'm like, no, your friends need to quit saying crappy stuff, so and it's exhausting. It's exhausting to have to do that sort of thing. But it's funny because I had always kept my art separate. Like this is what I do in art. And then this is me, like the local activist. And so like now I'm trying to figure out, like you said, I'm like trying to figure out how to bring those two things together. And I've sort of got a body of work forming in my head. That's exploring identity too, because as an Asian, I've said this a lot to people in my circles, is that we have been living off borrowed white privilege for a long time. We really have. And a lot of people in my generation and younger are recognizing that and calling it out, which I'm really glad for. Because like, it's so stupid. The racism against us is still there. We're still never really going to actually belong or whatever, because we're not white, and so like the moment that white supremacist mentality needs a scapegoat, it's going to pick you, it's going to pick me, it's going to pick Native Americans, it's going to pick anybody else. So, I mean, it's like, I don't know. It's like once you've been open to it, you can't ignore that it's there.
Right. And I was in thinking about this conversation yesterday. I found myself like wondering what the difference of experience might be for Asian Americans or even just Filipino Americans versus Asians who, kind of born, raised, and live within their culture and have lived, because it's really easy to, I think, for even the arts world to say, oh, this is an Asian artwork that reflects Asian culture and it's, 100% Asian, versus someone who might have been born and raised in America, but has Asian history or Asian ancestry. And kind of, as you express, is, more, is somewhat in touch or in tune, but not fully, because you've had pretty much a full American experience being raised, growing up in America.
Yeah.
And I guess, is there a distinction between that experience and kind of what do you think like the artwork looks like that comes from that distinction?
I don't know, because there's hardly any artists.
Yeah.
Would you believe that, growing up when I was in high school, I was in art classes and I was in AP art, but my parents were the ones who were going to be paying for college, and I straight up was not allowed to major in art. I ended up having a degree in art because I kind of convinced them that if I went into graphic design, at least I could get a job, and they were just like, fine, just make sure you graduate. But like, it wasn't until, so I was a goldsmith for a while, that, I didn't do graphic design out of college. I ended up, apprenticing to a goldsmith for a few years, and I worked in the jewelry industry for a lot of years. And then when I finally decided to come back to fine art and painting, I was like in my 30s, and it suddenly dawned on me that I never really thought about it, but I grew up unconsciously thinking that there were no such things as professional artists in the Philippines. Oh, wow. Because I'd never heard of them. I'd never even heard of Filipino American artists. Like, I just didn't even know if they existed. And I mean, I still have a really hard time. I'm finding them. Like, there are actually a lot, but I mean, it's hard to find any that have any notable achievements that would be recognized outside the art world, and then like, another thing I wanted to point out just about the Filipino culture is that we're in Asia, but we're not like any other Asian culture because of the Spanish. So like, a friend of mine once referred to us as the Latinos of Asia, which I had
Oh,
never
wow.
heard of before. And actually, it really rubbed me the wrong way the first time I heard, because I was like, no, we're Asian. And then the more I thought about it, I'm like, oh my God, we are Hispanic. Because just like all the countries in, like Mexico and
Yeah.
Central America and South America, we had that heavy Spanish influence and that heavy Catholic influence. And I'm like, yeah, we are totally Hispanic,
Wow.
But it's weird too, because, like there's this whole form of Filipino martial arts that is very much like other Asian martial arts forms.
Yeah.
And I mean, like all this stuff that I didn't even know existed. So I'm kind of like in this uncomfortable place where I've been rejecting my culture for decades. And now I'm trying to like figure out how to be in touch with it. I watched a really cool documentary recently where this Filipino woman who was born in the Philippines and then raised in the US, and she's now living in the UK. She flew to the Philippines to go meet this woman who's a tattoo artist, and she's like lives up in the mountains, and she's like 100 years old. She's like 100, 102 years old, and she's keeping this tattoo technique alive. And now, because of the internet and people finding out about her and the other tattoo artists that she's training, people travel from all over the world to come get these tattoos. And they're tribal tattoos, they're Filipino tribal tattoos. And I thought it was really interesting because like there's this one guy who's full Filipino but adopted by a white couple and raised in the US, and he was out there waiting on his turn to get a tattoo, and he said like he's really excited about being able to do this thing that's part of his culture, but he also feels like it feels a little bit like appropriation because he wasn't raised with it. And I feel I really resonated with that because that's how I feel. Like I grew up here, and what can I claim? What can I make part of my world? Because it's never been a part of my world, but it's still a part of me.
Wow. Yeah, I find myself like, I think about that in regards of like African art and its exploitation by African American artists or appropriation, because it comes from a sense of not knowing our histories beyond, slavery, and wanting some connection to something, but then it easily be turned into, can turn into this thing of these symbols, like West African and Dinka symbols are like most popular African symbols used by African American artists, and it's an easy thing to connect to, I think, and it's probably the most well-known set of symbols, I think, based out of Ghana. I don't even know how they became the most popular ones, but they're everywhere, and I've referenced them in my work, and it's always this sense of trying to connect to some other culture that we might not have been raised on, but I think there's this underlying like intuitive sense or feeling that's like there's something there that I'm trying to connect to, and that's one thing I've been kind of combating with, because I've in wanting to create work that's symbolic and has these different meanings. Is like, oh, how can I tell this story with these different symbols? And then I found myself that in thinking that it's because I'm not. It was either like a fear or a lack of recognizing the symbols of the culture that I was particularly raised in, and wanting to use that as a way to express my understanding of faith and culture, and being like, I don't know, it's been there. So I find myself like I love when people do get to that point or reach that point in their in their careers, like, all right, I'm making this kind of art, but I'm trying to attach it or get to something else. But then it's like, is that even your culture? Not saying that for you, but it's specifically for like the African American communities. Like, is that even for me? Is that my culture? How viable is the culture that we've built here in America? And I think it's highly viable, but it's just like this intuitive connection. And I found it like it was something as small as like, I remember reading an article or reading a book about African art where they had water, and they built these like water bins to collect rainwater from like the drainage system. And I saw it and I was like, my father does this all the time. Like we have buckets outside all around the house by the drains collecting water. And that was something that I was just like, well, that's a way that I can easily connect to, like this intuitive culture is like the way that we look at the earth or see the earth and want to connect to it is like we do these things that I don't see pop up maybe in other cultures. And so maybe it's the study of those things and not necessarily these symbols that help us relate to cultures that we're connected to, but we might not have had an experience growing up in.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like lately I had been thinking about, how the Philippines was under Spanish control for like 400 years. And my maiden last name is Federico, which sounds Italian, but I mean, it's from the Spanish, because the Spanish basically went and renamed a bunch of us. Like if they didn't like our last names, or if we came from an easily conquerable province or whatever, they just doled out, like they just put people in a line and said, okay, your last name is this, and your last name is this, and your last name is this. Yeah. And, I thought about that. And as a woman too, living in a patriarchal society, I think about how, like, it's just funny because, women these days are like, well, I'm just going to keep my last name. And well, it wasn't your last name. It's like, first you belonged like to your father, you belonged to your husband or whatever. And I took my husband's last name, and I'm perfectly happy with that. But I think it's really interesting that I'm like, all those years of cultural repression, like what, and the country itself, I mean, it's named after King Philip of Spain. Like we don't even have a name that we picked for ourselves, because, like, I don't know if you know this, there are like 7,000 islands in the Philippines. And the joke is, like, at high tide, there's like 5,000, but like, there's so many, like everything was just different tribes and different provinces. And it wasn't a united set of islands when the Spanish came. And, like there was no sense of a country when the Spanish came. So, and then like down in the far South, those countries are Muslim, and there are a couple of big terrorist groups down there that have been trying to fight for being released from the Philippines, because they want to form their own Muslim country. And so there's like, just this whole idea of like, what would we have been if we had been left alone? Like, I don't even know. So, like,